This video is going to focus on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland as we begin looking at all of the organs of the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus, you're probably familiar with where it is. It forms the floor and the walls of the third ventricle in the brain. You probably already studied during the brain that it has some primitive functions of the body, water balance, thermoregulation, sex drive, and even childbirth. But many of those functions are carried out by the pituitary gland. And so a lot of times we overlook the hypothalamus because it is secreting hormones that are headed straight to the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is suspended from its little pituitary stalk, and it is very tiny, approximately the size and shape of a kidney bean. And it has two structures that have independent origins and separate functions. So it has two lobes, if you will, but really they come from different origins, and we're going to see the embryo development here in just a second. And they have different functions. So the anterior pituitary comes from an outgrowth of the pharynx, whereas the posterior pituitary is a downgrowth from the brain, and those are during embryo development. So you can see where they're coming from different places, but they form together or develop together, and now we kind of lump them together as the pituitary gland. So the anterior pituitary has 3/4 of the pituitary. It has more going on, and it is linked to the hypothalamus by the hypophyseal portal system. Basically, there's primary capillaries coming straight from the hypothalamus to the secondary capillaries in the anterior pituitary by venules. So the hormones from the hypothalamus are able to come straight to the anterior pituitary, and they regulate what those cells in the anterior pituitary are doing. The posterior pituitary has 1/4 of the pituitary. It is really nerve tissue, not a true gland. So the nerve cell bodies in the hypothalamus send fibers down the stalk, and then those fibers end in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And so those neurons secrete hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary until they are released in the blood. So that's a difference between the anterior and posterior. Anterior gets hormones that are going to stimulate a response, whereas the posterior gets hormones that are basically stored there until they're released. So there's both, and there's a graphic that's in your book that kind of just goes over all of the hormones coming from the hypothalamus. They are releasing and inhibiting hormones. That means when they get to the pituitary, they are either stimulating the release of new hormones or inhibiting the release of new hormones. They go from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. And then just depending on which hormones arrive, specific hormones are going to be secreted by the anterior pituitary. Now, I don't want you to worry about memorizing these hormones because there's going to be plenty more where these come from. I would rather you start working on the hormones of the pituitary. So there are 8 hormones produced by the hypothalamus. 6 of them go to the anterior pituitary and regulate the hormones there. And then 2, as we said earlier, go straight to the posterior pituitary, and they are stored there. And those 2 are oxytocin and ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. And so again, I don't need you to memorize these 6. They are releasing and inhibiting hormones. So they can either stimulate or inhibit the anterior pituitary and the hormones that it's going to release. So I'd rather you not memorize these, but it is going to be important to memorize the pituitary ones. So as it said on the previous slide, there are 2 hormones coming from the hypothalamus that head to the posterior pituitary. They are stored there and then later released, so you do need to know these 2, oxytocin and ADH. And so they are produced in the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary does not make them, it just stores them. Okay, so on to the anterior pituitary. There are 6 principal hormones. I do want you to memorize these. It's going to be important that you know that they are made in the anterior pituitary, and it's also going to be important that you know where they're headed, so where their target is. Okay, so there's two gonadotropin hormones. That just is a kind of a category because they have to do with gonads or sex organs. And they are FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. I don't mind if you get comfortable with the abbreviations, as long as if you saw the whole word, you would know what that meant too. So FSH is headed to the ovaries. It stimulates the secretion of the ovarian sex hormones, develops the ovarian follicles, and then in males, sperm production. It's headed to the testes in males. LH, also headed to the ovaries or testes, depending on the gender, works on ovulation, progesterone, and then testosterone in men. Okay, and then the third anterior pituitary hormone is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. It stimulates the secretion of thyroid hormone. Now, there's not just one thyroid hormone, but there's multiple, but it is heading to the thyroid, and that name says it all. It's exactly what it's doing. Okay, ACTH is going to the adrenal cortex of the adrenal glands to secrete these glucocorticoids, and you'll get real comfortable with ACTH because I'm probably never going to call it adrenocorticotropic hormone, but it is headed to the adrenal glands. And then prolactin, I'll probably use prolactin instead of PRL. It is going to the mammary glands, and it is headed there after birth. It tells the mammary glands to synthesize milk, and then also in males enhances secretion of testosterone by